a minute or two. Again, thank you all for joining us. We'll be starting the webinar in just a minute as we let other people join in. Okay, I think we can begin. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Joe Belch, and I serve as the interim Thomas and Evelyn Page Dean of the Fowler College of Business at San Diego State University. Welcome to our President's Lecture Series in conjunction with the Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs. We're honored to host the Hostler Institute in the Fowler College of Business, where we take a global mindset towards all our programs. The Hostler Institute supports coursework and activities surrounding international diplomacy and global business, student study abroad, and international research. Following the presentation, there will be time devoted to questions and answers. Please submit your questions for a speaker in the Q&A panel on the lower right side of your screen. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. I'm delighted so many of you have joined us today for this event, which is offered to our students, faculty, and staff, and the San Diego community in partnership with the Office of the President at San Diego State University. It is now my honor to introduce San Diego State University Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Salvador Hector Ochoa. Provost Ochoa joined San Diego State in July 2019 as the university's Chief Academic Officer. He came to us from the University of New Mexico and brings more than 20 years of academic leadership experience. I will now turn the program over to Provost Ochoa.
Thank you for the introduction, Dean Belch. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs and President Lecture Series. I would like to provide a special acknowledgement to Mrs. Chen-Ye Hostler, who has long been a champion of this lecture series, which encourages an open dialogue about important global issues. It is also my honor to welcome Congressman Susan Davis. Additionally, I send a special thank you to San Diego State University's vice presidents, deans, and other campus leaders, and all of our faculty for encouraging students to engage in dialogue and inquiry, and for developing and sustaining forums for intellectual conversations. For those of you who are new to this lecture series, I will first offer a brief history about the Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs, which plays a critical role in the educational mission of our university. The Institute was founded in 1942 as the Institute on World Affairs to inform students and faculty and the wider public on global affairs. Since its inception, the Institute has been guided by the operating motto, "Let the other side be heard." For the decades since 1942 and through the many fluctuations in our national and global political climates, this motto has remained both important and relevant, whether it be in the classrooms, in our place of work, and any other time we come together to celebrate and recognizing our differences. The Institute will be celebrating its 80th anniversary this fall. The Institute now holds in reverence the name of Charles W. Hostler, former U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain, who endowed the Institute in 2004. Mrs. Chen-Ye Hostler, who will speak shortly, carries on the legacy of distinction and goodwill. Born and raised in Taiwan, Chen-Ye moved to the United States to pursue higher education. She started out at Columbia University and later relocated to San Diego, where she attended and graduated from our great institution, San Diego State University. After working for large financial companies for many years, she established an import and export business, which took her to several parts of the world. During that time, she came to realize her passion for travel and for learning about different cultures. The Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs has provided our university and the greater San Diego community with high level and spirited intellectual engagement on a rich diversity of international issues and controversies. The Institute has hosted distinguished speakers from around the world that have included ambassadors, Nobel laureates, and world leaders. Please join me in welcoming a visionary leader who seeks to make the world a better place, Ms. Chinye Hostler.
It's a delight and my great pleasure to have the Honorable Susan Davis with us here today. I have been an admirer of hers and her stellar work in Congress for years. I look forward to her speech. Many thanks again.
Thank you, Mrs. Hostler. I now would like to welcome a good friend and supporter of San Diego State University, Congresswoman Susan Davis. Mrs. Davis represented California's 53rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives for 20 years. Her district included San Diego State University. During her time in Congress, Mrs. Davis served on the Committee on Armed Services, the Committee on Education and the Workforce, and the Committee on House Administration. Before serving in Congress, Mrs. Davis was elected to the California State Assembly and the San Diego Unified Board of Education. She also served as the executive director of the Aaron Price Fellows Program, a program designed to teach multi-ethnic high school students leadership and citizen skills. Mrs. Davis grew up in Northern California and graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in sociology. We are most delighted to have Congresswoman Davis as our honored speaker. Mrs. Davis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for inviting me, and especially for being here for the prestigious Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs Speaker Series. That was a special introduction, Provost Ochoa, and I really appreciate your kind words and being with you today. And it's such a pleasure to see you, Mrs. Hostler, Chinye. I want to thank you also for your very special words. And to Nancy Nicholson and Mark Ballum for your support and assistance. I have to say, I definitely needed that, especially with some of our technological challenges. You know, like all of you, I particularly miss looking out into a room and seeing if anybody is interested in what I have to say. So I hope you will all think about something that I say that you agree with, or even if you don't, and share it later. You know, we struggled with the title of my remarks. Well, I struggled because I have every confidence that you believe in the value and the power of global engagement and could speak about its importance at great length. That's why you work hard at what you do and why you are here. Today, unfortunately, we see divisive and overly personal divisions in our politics. So it's even more important to think about how both domestic and global connections populate our experience. In our time together, I hope to share some of my encounters, having been in elective office for 35 years, 25 of those in Congress. By taking you beyond the Beltway and highlighting how members take part in bipartisan, bicameral dialogues with the help of highly committed organizations with which you may not be familiar. Every one of you have important stories to share. That's the beauty of learning one another's perspectives. So I want to thank you for your patience as I share some of my background. I'll skip the early years. I grew up with essentially no international experience, unless you count my days at Berkeley during the free speech movement. While at a meeting in my senior year, I had one of those fortunate encounters of being at the right place, right time, and was recruited to go to Israel for a program called Service to the People. Students who had a pre-graduate school education lived on a kibbutz, and after a few months of language training, farming, and kitchen detail, were ready for community service. My assignment was at a small institute for new immigrants and hard to place boys. I was considered a social worker, though my language skills were limited. So what did I do? I taught English. I taught one of my charges enough English for one grateful young man to enroll in a school that genuinely changed his life. I think that was the first time that I really felt that I made a difference. Some days I wondered what I was doing in this strange environment, but that was mixed with the jubilation of speaking a new language, or making a difference. I experienced a fish out of water feeling a few years later. I had married, had a graduate degree in social work when my husband was assigned to the military. I was assigned to Japan during the Vietnam War. We lived on the economy, meaning that we did not have base housing by choice. That was our decision. We wanted to experience the country. Our one-year-old son had a baby brother 7 months after we arrived. No one could have prepared me for our challenges. We lived in a small neighborhood, unfamiliar with Americans, and away from any of the help the grandparents might provide. Fortunately, some English was spoken. And with my very limited Japanese, I communicated largely in sign language and became very close with my neighbors on a crowded, narrow street. I lived the life of moms around me, always having a watchful eye on all the children. It was an extraordinary 2 years, and yet we were ready to return to the United States. Through a series of unexpected circumstances, San Diego became our family home. One of the first things I had was to find a preschool. I chose a cooperative because I needed the socialization. I needed it in English as much as my 3-year-old. There I learned about the League of Women Voters and was introduced to many interesting and energetic women. They were focused both on local policy issues and on democratic processes. And their neighborhood meetings, above all else, had childcare. Without the leadership skills that I gained through League, I doubt if I would have had the confidence to consider elective office years later. Since I'm here with you at SDSU, I will mention 2 opportunities I had with the university. In 1981, I was asked to volunteer for a program, Luncheon in the Park, with KPBS radio host Jim Bousfield, where we interviewed amazing San Diego people and heard their stories. I was then offered my first position, coordinating outreach for the 80s popular KPBS auction. That took me out in many areas and neighborhoods, meeting new people, and it even gave me a kind of head start to volunteer walking precincts for several candidates in or seeking elective office. When a seat on the school board became open, I was helping a neighbor run. The prospect of being a candidate, though, changed for her, and my neighborhood friends encouraged me to essentially heed the call. I'd been involved. They thought I needed to do this. I still tell people that if you want to impact people's lives, the school board is the best place to be. Well, in my second term on the school board, I was asked to be the executive director of a 3-year program developed by the Price family, the Aaron Price Bellows program. It afforded students a hands-on course in civic engagement and responsibility and helped them socialize beyond their comfort zone. Our mayor, Todd Gloria, and many other students today are leaders out of that experience. Fast forward, I ran for the state assembly where my key issues were health, education, and consumer protection. As term limits ended my assembly representation after 3 2-year terms, I soon was encouraged to challenge an incumbent and successfully was elected to Congress. Here was an opportunity to help people in just a whole different way. My term began on January 4th, 2001. I recall one of the topics in orientation was extremism. We did not spend that much time talking about it. As a military spouse, and now representing one of the largest military personnel and operations districts, I requested the House Armed Services Committee out of an interest in the issues the men and women who volunteer and serve our country face when they put on the uniform. 9 months after being sworn in, the trade towers fell and our lives changed. Bin Laden became a household word. Everything became pre and post 9/11. All too soon, an Iraq war vote, which I actually voted against, was held, and quote, weapons of mass destruction, unquote, was heard nightly on the news. Being on the HASC meant that you were asked to go and visit the war theater and provide oversight on our operations. A first ask was to join colleagues in a special training with civil society groups organized by the USAID. Several female colleagues and I attended a large conference of Iraqi and Kurdish women in Jordan. It was an early eye-opener of the thirst women have to change their environment. I came away with a great appreciation to not judge people by their garments, especially when one's face was hidden. Some of the most insightful remarks came from women heavily covered with only their eyes indicating their interest, or in some cases disapproval. I learned not to make assumptions about the life experience women have. When asked to comment about how we develop shelters for women in the US, we spoke of seeking the cooperation of law enforcement. And the women laughed at us. They really laughed and they said, oh, police, they would be the last that they would summon. In fact, they feared police officers would return women to abusive family members or rape them. In addition to this kind of exposure, our small bipartisan group bonded in a way that months in Washington would unlikely have brought about. Later, on a congressional delegation trip to Iraq, when it was still safe to walk in Baghdad with security, we visited an overcrowded, antiquated hospital. There, I encountered a woman who tried to give me her recently born baby. The translation was that the baby would soon die, and I could save it by taking it away. That experience stayed with me. It's still with me. It was actually a time that members across the aisle routinely supported one another, and I remember that so well about this trip. In addition to all the work of committees on Armed Services and Education Committee, on the House Administration Committee, which we dealt with election reform, and all the votes that many of you probably followed, by my second term, I learned about the Aspen Congressional Institute. This invitation, only bipartisan bicameral group, began in 1983 under former Senator Dick Clark, with US-Russia-Soviet relationships as a primary focus. It grew over the years to today as 458 members have participated, including 35% of current members, in addition to 1,600 international parliamentarians, politicians, government scholars, and political leaders. I am told that I attended 260 breakfasts and 29 conferences. I'm putting up these photos taken in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in February of 2018 to show you the round discussion table that was connected for maximum participation. Always had to be round. Depending on the issues, preparation of an 8 by 11 inch booklets up to 1 inch thick are prepared for all the participants. So it's a lot of work. Why is it that this organization attracts members who do not necessarily have strong relationships across the aisle? Why has it been so successful in bringing members together? Well, I am told that there are a number of reasons that this makes a difference. The first really is no attrition. Everything is off the record, allowing members to speak freely and not have someone tweeting out their remarks. And the second is the dialogue is free of lobbyists, special interests, and all the arrangements have to be cleared by ethics. Another area of agreement, I think, for everybody is that one family member, spouse, or mature son or daughter is allowed to accompany the member. Through their shared experiences, spouses often help break through the partisanship and change the way members see one another. There's structure to the give and take so that no one can dominate. And this is really important, as you can imagine. Members are limited to a 3-minute question and or comment with probing interventions of 1 minute. Members are also assigned seats for all dinners to enhance getting to know one another and carry on conversations with the experts and guests. And of course, finally, traveling is an attraction, but members must be at every session and meal, take only a few-hour afternoon break, and participate roughly 9 hours a day. Hardly the kind of thing when we think about a junket. And the topics, of course, are current events, relevant, but they're not the kind of ones that are seen as pretty hard issues like perhaps gun control or abortion. Whenever the importance and the possibility of bringing the location and the topic together, as it did in looking at the state of Ethiopia's emerging democracy, Aspen was able to travel there. Didn't work out all the time that way, but in this instance, it did. And so I wanted to share these photos with you, are of a girls' school. And I can just tell you what a thrilling day that was. Interaction with young people was always a highlight. This photo, another photo, is with the Peace Corps. And that certainly enhanced our experience and that of the Corps. More than that, it helped solidify an appropriation for the Corps' range of responsibility. A number of visits were held, and we were delighted that we were able to get a better understanding of why we were there and what we can learn from our engagement. The most significant outcome, as we think about it today, especially, came from the pairing of interests and skill with the Nunn-Lugar Soviet Threat Reduction Act that was passed in 1991. Well, I certainly wasn't there to witness their interaction at Aspen, but there are many stories supportive of the former Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia and Dick Lugar of Indiana's interaction with one another, and of course, with the former then Soviet Union. They were both steeped in the issues, but the facilitation and the time away from Washington made a difference. In my experience, I saw how the Cures Act to fight cancer, among other life-threatening diseases, was facilitated by a relationship deepened by the gentlewoman from Colorado and the gentleman from Michigan as a result of time spent at Aspen breakfasts and conferences. It's far too numerous to list the many challenges around the world Aspen covered. We were involved in 2 wars for much of the time. So programs on extremism were a focus, as well as Russia, China, Africa, climate, and North Korea. It was a program on North Korea that was held in April of 2018 that led to the global policy series that our office developed. In one of those moments at dinner, while we were recapping the day, the talk turned to Congress's role in sharing some of the concerns raised. And I mentioned that it was customary to have town hall meetings, which I know you're all familiar with, but they were usually focused on constituent political issues, really less on foreign affairs. Thinking out loud, I said how great it would be looking at Dr. Sigrid Hecker, who was a renowned scientist and had been to North Korea examining their nuclear program 7 times. I looked at him and just said it would be great if, he could speak to my constituents. And without blinking, he said, I quote, "Well, invite me to San Diego. I'm happy to speak with your constituents," unquote. So we also had former General and Ambassador Professor Carl Eikenberry at the table. And so he also weighed in, and we prepared to enlist a panel of experts. I'm so grateful for their contribution and that of others, local talent here from San Diego, Dr. Alan Greb at SDSU. Our global policy series was born. We held 6 programs, including one on Iran, as well as Russia, China, the Middle East, cybersecurity, and climate. Dr. Mark Merrifield and Dr. Walter Ochol, both from SDSU Department of Biology, presented on climate, and Rear Admiral Ken Slatt, who was then a professor here, moderated the cyber panel. As you can see, these programs were well attended and got enthusiastic responses. We were planning a 7th program when COVID emerged. In addition to the work with Aspen, I was honored to be an active participant in the House Democracy Partnership, a bipartisan commission of 20 members established in 2005 to support the development of effective, independent, and responsive legislative institutions. The critical bipartisan focus through the exchanges brings a love of politics and the ambassadorial spirit to the interaction among all the office holders. The message was always that we are here to partner with you. Democracy was always said, as we always say, is a work in progress. It is a work in progress. And we have to be critical of our ability to live up to its challenges. So strengthening democratic principles is the consensus driving force. Despite the concerns today, we see backsliding in a number of the countries that I've already mentioned, and all over the world to a certain extent. The role of women is highlighted on these trips, and the women who participated often held sessions to speak specifically to the concerns of our female hosts. We know that countries cannot succeed when half of their people are not able to perform anywhere near their potential. Some of the strongest, most capable female leaders have had to work in an oppressed environment, and they work hard to stay above it. Several of the countries that we worked with, such as Tunisia, South Sudan, North Macedonia, and Ukraine, have had their share of crises, as we see today, and it's fair to say that they are far from their goals as well. Of course, as you can see from this photo, we have some memorable engagements, such as the one in Tibet with the Dalai Lama. He had lunch with us and even insisted on serving. That was an incredible, incredible time. The people of Tibet didn't ask for much, but to not let us forget their struggles. We met with Richard Gere, as you see in this photo, an American actor, after the trip, as he is a strong supporter of Tibet, and it was common for us to report our findings and our experiences to other ambassadors, to interested individuals, and he was one of those. The additional photo here is from Indonesia with our partners. The Democracy Partnership invites parliamentarians, officials, and administrators to Washington to share practices that are developed over the years. For example, for many countries, they don't have anything like the Congressional Research Service, where members can easily access information and provide oversight of its leaders. In some cases, they actually have no staff as well. So the partnership provides an opportunity for counterparts to meet in a safe and sustained setting and learn how to prepare local leaders for their responsibilities. And we believe that that has resulted in timely and transparent work. Well, COVID prompted other discussions as well. And as you can see, this was a virtual discussion that we were having on drafting legislation and how to form coalitions to achieve change, to actually help legislation pass. This was with one of our partners from Kosovo. Well, you might be wondering now how the changing political situation would have an effect on how we are viewed in our ability to share our values and encourage constituent-centered democracy. Well, in reality, from 2016 to 2020, when one could expect that this would have happened, the change in administration did not really become an issue to our counterparts, their receptivity, at least, to our questions, to our concerns, to our interaction. I think it did affect some of the messages coming through from our ambassadors, but that was really a time that they were very discreet as well, as we would all certainly expect. One place where there was greater interest in domestic politics came from our counterparts at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. In fact, I participated and then was nominated by the Speaker when we held the Assembly's presidency. I was actually encouraged to do that by a Republican member. And then after alternating with our European counterparts, we once again, at this moment, hold the presidency of the NATO Assembly, which is a good thing. And this time it is a Democrat who happens to hold that position. Well, not only happens to, of course, once you're the winner, essentially, of the House, then you control the agenda. And that's one of the things, of course, that's always interesting to share with people, because it's kind of hard sometimes to always understand it all. But in this case, of course, the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, appointed me to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. People didn't raise questions at that time about our receptivity, but they were concerned actually about whether or not there was some concern about the NATO Assembly continuing. We were asked about our working relationships at home and how we felt about the position of our now former president toward NATO. And, that was a time when I made a comment and shared with people some of the concerns that we might have had, but I also asked them to please ask our friends from across the aisle about their point of view on that, because I thought that was really important to hear from them. I think most of our colleagues shied away from engaging on that topic, but it was important because it was something that certainly was on the mind of the other parliamentarians. When I think about my activity in the NATO Assembly, I am reminded of the attempt for bipartisanship that the group makes in its travels to the meetings and its interactions. In fact, it may even have an effect on the mostly cordial relationships on the HASC, because the HASC is considered to be one of the most bipartisan of House committees. So the opportunity to be part of the NATO Assembly was one more example of how members work well together when they are beyond the Beltway. And finally, I want to close with my most proud and difficult engagement. I mentioned earlier how, as a member of HASC, we were asked on numerous occasions to visit our troops. I was on an early delegation trip to Afghanistan. We traveled by military transport, as is common, and landing in the country was a real shock. There were rusty Russian tanks everywhere. We went to the palace to visit Hamid Karzai. Broken windows had not even been replaced. I recall being the only woman in our group, not an unusual occurrence. And at one meeting, I saw an Afghan woman and asked if I could speak with her, because the men were not allowed to at that particular time. She spoke English and had led one of the many underground schools for girls, and I was inspired by her courage. A few other trips followed. When I was able to chair the Armed Services Personnel Subcommittee, I started a Mother's Day trip to meet with our many female troops stationed in Afghanistan and begin a sustained effort to support the Afghan women. What followed was 12 years of Mother's Day bipartisan visits by 6 female members, getting to know the role that our women particularly played in the war. Our repeated visits were unusual, so were the relationships formed across the aisle. I alternated the so-called chair and co-chair responsibility with a member from Alabama. It's clear that we could not win in one another's district and had different core beliefs in some critical areas, but we became best of friends. We observed the positive influence that our female troops brought to civilians in remote areas, filling a place of trust with Afghan women that the male troops just couldn't do. In the process, our so-called lionesses brought significant intel to the fight against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and others, and that was extremely significant. The women trusted them. Photos show our troops and the Mother's Day cards that we brought from local schools. One of these cards particularly got all of our attention, and I'm sharing that with you. So I hope you will enjoy a laugh from one of these cards. I also want to share that for the safety of our Afghan guests, we have our hosts, Afghan hosts. I have a number of photos, but we're going to blur the images of the women in those for their safety, just to be sure. It is said that the hardest place to be a woman is in Afghanistan, and I think that's a reality. We met countless women of strong will who wanted to bring peace to their country. They organized and learned problem solving and negotiating skills with the support of the US and our allies there. And for most of them, fear of assault, even death, was something they lived with whenever they walked out of their home. In order to hold elections, Afghan women are needed to screen women voters. The effort to train women to do this began with efforts to bring women into law enforcement and the armed services. The need to attract and recruit women safely needed special separate appropriations in order to be targeted properly. Well, we had much to learn about raising these issues in a culturally competent way, but we persisted, and what emerged was a greater effort to prepare women for both local and national military service. The fact that women cast 35% of the vote in the 2014 presidential elections, the highest rate in Afghan history, really garnered notice. And that preparation of the women being able to help made a huge difference. And many of them went on to other careers and often in law enforcement. The question of whether our coalition of countries worked too hard creating a Western military force, well, that's a legitimate question that people ask. Was there an alternative that would have yielded a different outcome? I'm not sure anyone can answer that, especially with such long-standing complexities that often identify just a mere fraction of the issues that people are facing there. On the social economic scale, we know that Afghanistan is a very different place when educated and skilled women engage. Civil society hoped, and they believed that preparation for a more inclusive populace, even in the midst of tribal factions, would be a strong antidote to the ignorance and intolerance of a failed state. Our national security interest in Afghanistan acknowledged this, but it's fair to say that our vast resources went to instruments of war rather than peace. We learned much from our visits. Number one, the importance of showing up. When we told the women in a very poor remote province that we visited that we hope to return, they were doubtful and very surprised and pleased when we did again and again. We gained an important perspective from hearing the principal say during the Taliban that she had no students because there was so much violence against the acid was thrown in their faces. But post-Taliban, she told us that she didn't have enough desks. Secondly, not judging people by their cover. No assumptions of what people think, what they like, what their challenges are. When asked in their small rural council what is important to their future, the women responded that they wanted to learn computers. We probably wouldn't have thought that as the first thing they would mention. And think through what and how you measure progress. Capacity building is as important as sustainability. They both need to be looked at strongly, and look to changes. Look to changes from young people. One woman told me that she has hope because her son is showing respect for his sister. Judge success by roles women take on and manage beyond expectations. We saw that time and time again. I wasn't sure when I would visit Afghanistan after leaving Congress, but I could not have predicted this devastating outcome. People see 20 years lost quite understandably. I'm with them on that. For those of us, though, that were focused on the remarkable changes in young girls' aspirations, there is only sadness and anger. What gives me some hope is that women are rallying and creating avenues for growth wherever they can, despite the threats to their lives. And as we meet today, schools are opening for girls and boys in places like Jalalabad due to the work of San Diego Rotaries, actually, that have been involved there for years. And I know that SDSU has played a role in that as well, working in collaboration with the Rotary and with other groups. So as I conclude, I want to reach out to all of you. We have the opportunity to take part in efforts to settle Afghan families here. San Diegans have always responded to the strength and the resilience in people seeking a better life. For Afghans forced to leave their home and loved ones in the middle of unimaginable chaos, as I hear their stories, it requires navigating a transition from trauma to self-sufficiency and full participation in civic life and our economy. San Diegans, I believe, who play a role in helping our newest refugees be successful, will benefit and be enriched through their involvement. Making a difference in people's lives here in San Diego and encouraging neighbors to do so is now a global connection and one of the most meaningful things that I hope to do. Thank you all so much for listening, for being with us today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis, for your fascinating experiences, sharing your fascinating experiences during your time in Congress, and for your service to the country. I think we all yearn for some of those times you talked about when people were reaching out to one another across the aisle, and hope that we can get there again. We would now like to open our question and answer session to the audience. You can find the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window where you can add your questions. We will try to get to as many as we can, but I will start out by asking the first question. In your discussions with women in different countries, can you highlight how women's issues varied from country to country?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, I think that we all recognize that the issues that women have actually are pretty universal. I just spoke of Afghanistan, and of course they have to deal with security issues above everything else. And we heard that. You really couldn't engage without talking about security. And for many of them, they felt like women who were well known in the communities needed added security. This is true also in countries, their neighbors, Pakistan, India, countries where women's agency is not acknowledged or acted upon. But there are many successful women, as we know in our history as well, in every field imaginable, and now being recognized more. One of the overarching issues, and there are many ways to highlight this, is the one I just saw written by Marianne Siegert, talks about the authority gap, that women are not taken seriously. You hear that wherever you go. Every woman, as she says, has a story of being underestimated, ignored, challenged, or patronized in the workforce. In fact, I told a story, one of my stories in Kenya, and all the women identified with it. The room exploded after I told it, because they all looked at each other and said, that happened to me. And here we were in Kenya. It was just amazing. The other thing that is really different about the women, depending upon where we were, is whether, and I'm talking about the parliamentarians in this instance, because where there's a strong party system, they have to navigate that as well. So on the one hand, they don't have to run independently. They don't have to raise the money alone, but they are dependent on where those in control, usually men, in fact, always men, control the list, the party list of how or whether or not they're going to be accepted. And that's something that really makes a difference in the conversations that we had in helping them to think about that, because of course that's not an issue that we deal with in that same way. But I love it how universal the issues are and how interested women are in one another. And I mentioned, I want to also say about the ability to have an ally with the men there in their parliaments, as well as the men in our Congress. And that makes a difference as well. And I think that they're beginning to encourage that and really to engage in that way. And I think that we'll be much better off when we can do that as well.
Thank you. Our second question, at the moment, all eyes are on Ukraine, and rightfully so. And so I have to ask, can you talk about your experience in Eastern Europe and your assessment of the situation?
Sure, I will try to do that. And of course, it's really important to realize that I look at the same thing that everybody's looking at right now. So I'm looking at CNN and you know, I'm even watching C-SPAN, trying to pick up some additional areas. But I think it's obvious that we're all trying to get good information. You know, very quickly, I'm going to try and just mention one or two things. I happened to be in Ukraine on December 26th so that was 2004, I believe, when Ukraine was experiencing a second round of voting for the presidency, and the two candidates were Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. And there was a second round because neither one of them had gotten the majority. Yushchenko won that race with about 52% of the vote. And we witnessed the campaigns of both those gentlemen. And the Yushchenko one was just like a Western style campaign. I mean, you know, very excited young people, particularly, and very crowded, and, you know, just tremendous amount of energy. On the other side, not so really. And it was just such a strong contrast. And the other thing I learned is that they actually go to the home of people who cannot get to the polls. And so they have this whole process of going to and having people vote. You know, that period of time is significant, I think, in what's going on now, because it was a loss. Obviously, and that was something that Putin was watching strongly. Things changed, and Yanukovych came back and actually did take the presidency at a later time. I listened to Anne Applebaum last night, and she said a few things that I thought were important and sort of identified with some of my feelings as well. You hear a lot about whether or not Ukraine can count on being in NATO at some time. And she said, you know, it's not about NATO. It is about sovereignty, though. And it is about the fear. And if we believe that Putin is rational or not so rational, it's about that fear of losing control totally of the motherland, that somehow people will see the opportunity for a better life elsewhere. And to the extent that increases and is comprehensive in that it would move to the east would be significant to him. And so this long held desire and belief for some reason is coming to our doorstep in a sense. And that's, you know, that's very significant. I think the other thing that picked up today just very, very briefly is that the Congress is engaged, of course, the president is engaged with many other countries now, which is our friends, our allies, NATO, that's critical. And I think it's great to see that. The sanctions are being discussed as whether or not they go maybe too far in some people's minds, but not far enough, especially as it affects the oligarchs who have benefited over the years. And we know that Germany, of course, is halted the Nord Stream 2, and that's a healthy and a good sign as well. So I think that, like everybody else, we always ask, is Putin rational in this, and what is he thinking? And we don't know, but now at least we finally see it in front of us, and I think that our President Biden has done, I think, a good job, probably an excellent job in trying to send the signals that we're watching, we know what you're doing, and no surprises here.
Thank you. Very interesting question from the audience. For those of us that would like to get involved in local efforts that support some of the causes you discuss, can you suggest some starting places? Are there local organizations we might look to?
Well, there are all kinds, actually. And I think that often during an election here in the United States, there are tremendous amount of opportunities for everyone to be involved. I think with young people, I always encourage them, do a little research. You can get a lot of information online today, especially, and get a feeling for who those people are. I mean, it may be a school board race. I think those are critically important, and I would encourage them to do that. Today, because we have many Afghans arriving and have arrived in San Diego, people who have an interest in being involved can get in touch with any number of agencies here. There are 4 major agencies that are working on this: the International Refugee Committee, Rescue Committee, the IRG, the Jewish Family Services, Catholic Charities, and the Alliance for African Assistance. I'm actually working with the Alliance for African Assistance and working with my own neighborhood to develop a group of individuals that are able to respond and work with a family and to really help them negotiate this very, very difficult transition. As I mentioned, it's extremely difficult situation that they came in. And yet I'm always impressed by the resilience and the way in which people approach this situation that none of us, we think about our own selves. It's not something that we can do. So there is that, and they're available. There are all kinds of opportunities. The other thing is, for people that are watching, it depends on whether if you're in school and you have the ability to help and mentor a student, your local elementary school is a great place to go and to have an opportunity to work with children who will greatly benefit from your help, and you yourself will, as I said, the mentor always benefits a great deal by that experience.
Again, from the audience, what are your thoughts regarding AmeriCorps, Vista, or serving in the Peace Corps as a way of giving back?
Oh, well, I think, those are all tremendous organizations. The Peace Corps, there are a number of members of Congress who were in the Peace Corps, and the way that they approach issues is unique. Because they did it in a way when they had very few tools to do it. And they have a lot to share and a lot to teach us. I think any of those opportunities, I believe strongly, this has been one of my concerns, I think we should have national service, universal national service in this country. People have talked about ways that young people can travel, even within their own communities, outside their comfort zone. That's one of the things that we learn in the Aaron Price Fellows Program. there are so countless ways to do that. And if anybody is out there and they're trying to figure out what they can do, give me a call because there really are tremendous opportunities. If we've looked at lots of different ways of trying to have a national service program. And the reality is there was even a commission that was part of a piece of legislation that was looking at that. And in the end, it's costly. It's not the easiest thing to ramp up immediately, but because we have a number of other core groups that are working in communities, we ought to be able to do this. And I think it should be a priority. I have a feeling that if we could pass a big Build Back Better bill, that we would see some opportunities for that, certainly in terms of apprenticeships in communities and other ways that people would have an introduction to the workplace different than they might have later in life.
And one final question. What is your advice for the students in our audience who might be interested in getting involved in politics?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I always tell young people is that, you know, do whatever you do it for your own learning, for personal growth. Don't think about it in terms of politics per se, but keep an account of it. You know, I'm not very good at, you know, writing everything down all the time. So I can't speak from personal experience always. I didn't do that like I should have. But if you're able to make notes of the people that you're working with, the people you meet, it's one thing to, you know, have a card for somebody, but unless you do a pretty good job of writing down some specifics, you're not going to be able to relate to it. But for those of you who have an interest in politics, do the best at what you do, but always, you know, you're thinking about where you want to go after that last experience. And the people that you work with are the ones who you can look to help you with more ideas and more plans. And if that's in politics, doesn't start out that way maybe, but down the line, you'd be surprised how many people you have will remember you and will want to help you in the future, particularly if you're going into politics, which we know is just, you know, really, really difficult of everybody. So keep a journal if you can and get involved. It really does matter.
Great advice. And thank you so much, Mrs. Davis, for joining us today. We've enjoyed hearing about your experience in Congress and the very insightful information that you've shared about what's going on in the world around women and many other issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's been here today. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. This will conclude our seminar. We hope you really enjoyed it. And we want to thank the Hostler Institute for the sponsorship of yet another very interesting and successful webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon.